This is one of the rarest and most sought-after moments that you can experience in the Pokémon franchise. Shiny Pokémon are unexpected, statistically unlikely, and instantly unforgettable. For many of us, a first encounter becomes a core memory, but in Pokémon Colosseum, that memory can quickly turn into a nightmare.
Because in this game, shiny Pokémon aren't always what they seem. Today we're looking at how Pokémon Colosseum completely breaks shiny Pokémon, and the surprisingly simple reason why. Pokémon Colosseum isn't your typical Pokémon game. There are no wild Pokémon roaming the region at all. Instead, you play as a former member of the villainous Team Snag'em, setting out to stop the evil organization Cypher from creating shadow Pokémon. Pokémon that have been turned into emotionless, controllable weapons. And to do that, you're gonna have to steal these corrupted Pokémon directly from other trainers. And that single design choice is exactly what breaks shiny Pokémon.
The first crack reveals itself the moment you battle a shadow Pokémon for the first time, because a shiny will never appear. And here's the problem. Just because you don't see a shiny, doesn't mean it isn't. There's no sparkle, no alternate colors, nothing to indicate that anything about this Pokémon is special at all. That is, until you catch it. If you successfully catch a shadow Pokémon, there's a possibility that it may have silently transformed into a shiny as it enters your party or PC. And if you weren't aware of this strange quirk, you'd probably assume that these Pokémon were shiny locked and miss out on the opportunity to hunt them. But luckily, if you fail to catch a shadow Pokémon in the first battle, the game does give you a second chance.
After beating the main story, every shadow Pokémon you missed and their original trainers can be found once again in a new location somewhere in the region. But somehow, these rematches are where shiny shadow Pokémon take an even darker turn. In these battles, the shadow Pokémon that previously would never appear as a shiny suddenly begin to sparkle. And for the first time, your opponent can potentially send out a shiny shadow Pokémon. And now that we finally see him, something about him feels off. In fact, many of the Pokémon in this game don't have the shiny colors you'd expect. Instead, they look like they're a shade or two away from the real thing, or as if an ugly filter has been slapped over their existing models.
Others like Metagross stray wildly from their original color schemes altogether. Then there's Heracross, who looks like someone started coloring him in and just gave up halfway through. Umbreon looks like an alien, and Diglett looks like a watermelon. You get the idea. There's a lot of weird and ugly shinies in this game, but some do stand out as an arguable improvement, like Suicune with its jet black mane, and Quilava with its wildfire. Let us know what you think about these shiny Pokémon in the comments.
As crazy as these designs are, they're not half as crazy as what's gonna happen when you snag one from your opponent. When you check your party or PC, only a regular Pokémon sits inside. And no, you didn't imagine it. The game showed you a shiny and then took it away after you caught it. And here's the worst part. Whether that Pokémon was actually shiny or not was already decided the very first time you battled that trainer. Because the moment an opponent sends out a shadow Pokémon in your first encounter, the values that determine its shininess are locked in for the rest of the game, even across rematches. So if you fail to catch it the first time and discover it isn't shiny in the rematch, it will never be shiny. The only way to hunt that Pokémon again is to start an entirely new save file just to encounter it for the first time again.
Speaking of shiny hunting, Pokémon Colosseum is still one of the worst games to do it in. The game already moves at a snail's pace, but on top of that, you can only save at a PC. Meaning you often have to replay entire sections for hours at a time just to reach that same battle and try again. At this point, shiny Pokémon in Colosseum don't just feel rare or broken, they feel inconsistent. And here's the important part. Pokémon Colosseum was never designed for you to find shiny Pokémon in the first place. The developers actively tried to shiny lock the game, but failed spectacularly. Instead of preventing shiny Pokémon from existing at all, Colosseum only stops them from appearing visually during your first encounter. But here's the problem. While the game hides shinies in battle, it never actually disables shininess itself. That's why a Pokémon that looked completely normal can randomly turn shiny after you catch it. But that still doesn't explain the strangest outcome. Why a Pokémon can be shiny in a rematch, and then lose its shininess the moment you catch it.
To understand that, we need to talk about how shiny Pokémon are actually created. Imagine that every Pokémon is born with a hidden ID number, and every trainer, including you, has not just a visible trainer ID, but a secret one as well. Whenever you encounter a Pokémon, the game checks these 3 numbers against each other, and if they line up in a specific way, that Pokémon becomes shiny. So being shiny isn't just something the Pokémon is. It's something that happens when a Pokémon and a trainer are put together. And this is where Pokémon Colosseum breaks shinies completely, because unlike every other Pokémon game, the Pokémon you're battling aren't generated for you. They're generated for your opponent. So when a shadow Pokémon appears shiny in a rematch, it's not shiny for you. It's shiny because of their trainer ID. The game is correctly displaying a shiny Pokémon, just from the opponent's perspective. The moment you capture it, ownership transfers to you. Their trainer data is overwritten, and when that happens, the magic combination that made it shiny while it was in your opponent's hands disappears.
In fact, there's one special case where your very first battle is always a rematch. Upon arriving at Celebi's shrine, you find village elder Egan desperately holding off a Cypher Peon and their shadow Hitmontop. Because you see this Hitmontop for the first time before it's your turn to battle, it means Hitmontop is the only Pokémon in the game that could appear as a fake shiny the first time you encounter it. We don't know exactly why Colosseum's shiny lock failed so badly, but we have a theory. First, it's important to understand this. Pokémon Colosseum wasn't made by Game Freak. It was developed by Genius Sonority, a studio that wasn't just making its first Pokémon game, but its first game ever. And they weren't only tasked with building the very first 3D Pokémon RPG, they also had to make sure that all the Pokémon caught in the Generation 3 Pokémon titles could be transferred and function within Colosseum, including shiny Pokémon.
And to their credit, they clearly tried, going out of their way to create different portrait and PC box sprites for every possible shiny Pokémon. But once you combine how shiny Pokémon are created with the unique mechanics of Pokémon Colosseum, some very obvious problems start to emerge, and they likely knew it. So they attempted to shiny lock the game. The problem is, due to a fundamental misunderstanding of the systems they were building on, they failed. But those mistakes are exactly what turned Pokémon Colosseum into one of the most fascinating and frustrating shiny experiences in the entire franchise. But what do you think?
If you enjoyed this video, hit like and subscribe, it really helps more than you think. And if you want to give us a slap on the back, you can do that by becoming a member. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.